seconds because apparently there's 10 seconds. Good evening, guys, and welcome to Youth Views. This is Harry Khan and bringing to you guys Sunday night stream. It's been an eventful week in politics, and I have with me two comrades, regulars on the show now. We have Cooperman 247, also known as John.
Hello.
John, how are we?
I'm fine.
Good. And we have our main man, Guy, who joined us on the last stream as well. Guy, what's going on, mate?
It's great to be back. Very excited to talk about all the very interesting things that have been happening. But yeah, thanks for having me back.
It's been a sick week, hasn't it? Really.
Very good week. Yep.
Forget your EastEnders. Forget your Coronation Street. Houses of Parliament is where it's at. So, like I say, we'll run down what's been going on. But before we do that, I just want to say, and the reason why I haven't been streaming so much lately, you can probably tell I've got a little bit of a flu, and it's affected my throat. So I've had the sort of I'm at the end stages of it now. So bear with me if my voice goes a little bit croaky tonight. So as I say, it's been an interesting week in politics, and from the last time that we spoke, or maybe if we sort of even think about last week in politics, we were aware that the Ben bill, the bill that was in name constructed mostly by Hillary Benn and his colleagues in Parliament, looked like that it had defeated Boris Johnson and Cummings. If we were looking at this in a strategy side of things, it made the government go back to the table in respect of what to do now. And in effect, what the Ben bill had asked for of the government and been passed through the House was that the government would have to go back and basically get a deal which would be ratified through the House of Commons. If not, you would have to basically seek an extension. And so it looks as if that the government had conceded on that point. There were echoes, were there, guys, in respect of Johnson possibly defying the law. There were a little bit of slipperiness around him maybe following the law, but not in the way that the Ben bill would have requested. There was talk about going back into court, and I believe that the government had made reassurances to a court in Scotland that they would follow the law. But in effect, what had happened was we were hearing echoes last weekend of the European Union and the government basically back in talks for a deal, back around the table. There was a bit of a roller coaster in respect of that. Sometimes we were hearing the deal's off, sometimes it was on. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of Johnson and his doubters, those who said that the EU would never change their withdrawal agreement, well, we can say it's fair to say that actually they did come back around the table to discuss a new deal. And by around Thursday, we were hearing, we had Mr. Juncker and Boris in front of the media telling us that a deal had been agreed. And we'll talk a little bit about this later on, but in effect, the backstop had been scrapped, and basically some form of in terms of the Northern Ireland situation, some form of resolution had been achieved, except it looked as if that this particular deal saw a border through the Irish Sea, something that Mr. Johnson had said that wouldn't happen, and had promised the DUP at their conference last year that this would never happen, and it did happen. So that had pissed the DUP off, but seemingly had the ERG, the right-wing Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party, seemed to get them on board. So it looked like that, with the help of some Labour Eurosceptics, or those who are, you may argue, too scared to to let their constituents down and lose their MP jobs. Maybe with their votes, it was thought that that vote may get through. So anyway, Johnson called all of the MPs back to Parliament on a Saturday, as in this Saturday that had just sort of gone yesterday. First time in a number of years since that has happened. Unprecedented usually, but with a view to try and get this deal of his over the line. But the plotters had their plans as well. And in the use of that Saturday was unfortunately didn't go the way that the government had planned. And then we saw the emergence of the Letwin Amendment, which basically asked for the House would vote for the deal to be ratified only after the legal bill had been scrutinised, which basically opens the door for the whole deal to be the legal text to be scrutinised before the deal would have passed. Now, it's interesting that the government wanted the deal to be passed first because, generally speaking, the legal text after that would go through as a given. And interestingly, Johnson could come back outside of this and say, we have Brexit done. And this is something we're going to talk about a little bit later as well, because I will argue that Brexit, even past this post, is far from done. Anyway, the idea was that actually Mr. Johnson would be forced to go through and seek an extension, because there's no way in the world that the working agreement bill would be passed in the time that we have before the 31st of October, which is D-Day, which is do or die day, the day that Brexit is supposed to be done and that Johnson has promised the world that Brexit will be done. And it looks like that Letwin Amendment had forced the government to go back to the table then and send a letter to the European Union asking for an extension, which is what he did. And we are at the stage now where the media reported that an extension is likely to be granted because the EU probably don't want to be the ones responsible for taking us into a no deal. Guy, I want to bring you in first, my friend, because that's kind of where we're at in terms of summary. I don't know, you'll fill the gaps if I've missed anything.
Yep.
But we've had an interesting week, and we have an interesting week next week as well, don't we?
Yes. Well, it's been one of the biggest weeks in politics for a long time, and so much has happened. But I want to say that I'm extremely impressed with Boris Johnson, and for this reason, because he's managed to find a deal that's worse than Theresa May's.
Yeah, he has.
I didn't think that was possible, but he's managed it. So I suppose credit where it's due. If we look at Boris Johnson's deal, it threatens the deregulation on workers' rights. It threatens environmental regulations, and as we've heard from many people in Northern Ireland, it derails the Good Friday Agreement, one of the most precious agreements in the history of the United Kingdom. And I know no economic analysis has been done on this deal, but academics at King's College London did some of their own. It said that this deal, roughly over the course of the next few years, would cost our economy £50 billion, leaving everyone in the UK £2,000 worse off. So he's no hero, he's no saviour. He's come up with a deal that would ruin this country, just like we predicted.
And people always had their worries about what a deal would look like under Johnson. I think people were worried about Theresa May's deal, but her deal's looking quite angelic, isn't it, John, in comparison to Boris's deal?
Yeah, from what I can understand, the only real positive of this deal is that it's sorted out the Irish Brexit and backstop thing, which is the thing that sort of brought down May's deal, because let's see, that ended up angering the DUP. Though granted, Johnson has also angered the DUP, which they voted against the government with the Letman agreement, so they've probably screwed them, and they're not going to vote for the deal. So yeah, if that ever comes to pass, but granted. Now,
so how has he got the ERG on side then? Because that's what I want to know. Because
I assume they just want to get this done with and all that stuff, or they want Brexit get out of the way, kill off the Brexit party, have a general election, and crush Corbyn. I believe that's what they're probably doing. But maybe that or you could say let's see. We could argue that. Let's see that they never really they never really hated the deal in the first place when it was under Theresa May. They just personally hated her and wanted to undermine her and get someone that more into their preference, like Johnson.
Yeah, I would agree.
Or they just have no principle.
I mean, Guy, just bringing you back in here. I don't know if you saw that tweet. Lewis Goodall, who's a Sky News reporter, said earlier in the week, and just a little bit after, I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before, he said, had Theresa May's deal been this deal, had this been Theresa May's deal, let's say it like that, it would have been shot down exactly how her deal was. And actually, this may be, at that particular time, have been about a power struggle. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I completely agree with you, and I completely agree with what John just said. He's just quite rightly pointed out that the ERG are only going to support a prime minister or candidate that once that deal is approved, can carry them across the next few years in negotiations from a hard right standpoint, and they were never going to do that with Theresa May. So I don't think it's ever been about the content of the deal. It's always been about who's doing it. And from the fact that they've thrown all of their morals, if they even had it in the first place, in their objections to Theresa May's deal, the same objections that they should have had for Boris Johnson's deal have gone out the window. It's simply due to the fact that they've got their man on the inside now.
Some may argue you using the word morals in the same sentence as conservative.
Yeah, I apologise. That was a big mistake. Those two words shouldn't be in the same sentence, definitely.
Let's have a look at this on the screen, though. I don't know if you guys can see it, but certainly our viewers can see it.
I can see it.
This is this also comes into play, doesn't it? Because Hammond, good old Hammond, our ex-chancellor, very recent chancellor, was very vocal on this particular deal. And John, he talks about this potential that this deal could still potentially send us towards a no-deal situation towards the 2020. End of 2020. Do you know anything about that?
Oh yeah, I heard about that. Let's see. I think even Tim Farron, former Liberal Democrat leader, once pointed out to some of the Labour rebels that we trusted the Tories on certain amendments and stuff, but they didn't. They still found a way to get screw us.
Well, no, what that issue was on. That was the issue on that Guy has just talked about regards the concessions around the employment rights and ceilings on that. What this article is about here is that basically, I can't remember which news channel, but a member of the ERG, a member of Parliament called John Barron, was doing an interview, and he was asked about this particular deal, and he says, I don't particularly like the deal. I think that he's quoted as saying that it's as bad as May's deal. He said, however, and I think he may have let this slip. Who knows? He's very silly to have let it slip if it is a slip. That, but we still have a chance of getting a no deal, and that's because if there is no free trade agreement, decided and agreed by the two parties, i.e. the UK and the European Union, by the end of 2020, we will automatically fall onto WTO, i.e. no deal crash out terms. Now, I think, with any of us who are interested in this Brexit stuff and talking about trade agreements, we will know that trade agreements, generally speaking, don't happen in that small period of time, do they?
No.
Well, what we saw on Saturday, if we hadn't had the Letwin Amendment, or if it had fallen, Boris Johnson could have passed his deal in compliance with the Benn Act. And by the end of the week, they could have gone, oh, actually, we couldn't confirm this, we couldn't confirm that, and we would have crashed out with no deal. So that was the purpose of the Letwin Amendment. So in the short term, we prevented no deal. But I hate to agree with Philip Hammond, considering what he participated in over the last couple of years as Chancellor, cutting money to all of our vital services. But he's right on this issue, that by the end of 2020, if certain agreements haven't been reached, there's nothing legally binding that would stop us leaving with no deal. So I think maybe that's why he might have gone over the more adamant clean break Brexiteers, the ERG and his party, because they believe there's still a possibility for their no deal project.
John, do you think then that's probably why the ERG have come on board with this then?
Probably because let's see, they just want a no-deal Brexit. Let's see, but that's what they've always been. It's why they've given Theresa May so much trouble. I mean, granted, it's possible that they might have accepted just a hard Brexit deal back in like 2016 and 2017, back when Theresa May was at her peak. But after the 2017 election, when May weakened, they decided to go full-on hard deal. I mean, hard on Brexit.
So just looking at the comments, guys. I haven't had too many trollers since we've started these shows, but I think it's just for purposes of humour. I think it's worth just bringing, just showing. We have some chap here called Capitalist Hero. I don't know if we know him. If he's one of our pals.
He might be one of AA's he might be one of AA's for I know who follows Swiss and now follows you since you've interacted with Swiss.
Lovely guy. So let's have a look. Is Capitalist Hero even trying to make a point? Because I'm trying to find one in his. At
the moment, it just seems to be normal chatting.
I think he just said something. I was just trying to find this one a second ago. Brexit means Brexit. Here we go. Right. So Capitalist Hero says, "I'll introduce myself. I'm Capitalist Hero. I'm from Durham, and Brexit means Brexit." Well, isn't that what is going on, guys, at the moment? I mean, let's talk about this now because it's an interesting point. It sounds as if what Capitalist Hero is saying is that I think there's this notion here that we have a Remainer sort of set of MPs or majority of MPs in the House of Commons at the moment, and all of these bills that are going through, all of these amendments are going through, are basically in the intention of stopping Brexit. Now, what we heard on Saturday, and I caught some of the proceedings, not all of them. I confess that it was probably too much of a long day for me to catch all of them, is that repeatedly we were hearing MPs saying, but I still will back this deal, or I still want to have some form of Brexit delivered. Guy, just want to bring you in again. What do you think? Would you sort of agree with what Capitalist Hero is saying in terms of the notion that Brexit is trying to be defeated by a Remainer majority within the House of Commons, or would you say there are real true intentions to Brexit?
Unfortunately, Capitalist Hero, I'm going to have to disagree with that point, but also disagree in general with this comment, Brexit means Brexit. We hear this so much from so many Brexiteers, and I have complete and utter respect from the Remain and the Leave side. Both sides have valid arguments, and it's time our country came together on that. If we look at the Brexit, actually look at that. It's a phrase that was used back in the 2016 referendum after the Leave campaign had won, where they used this phrase in order to make it so unclear their intention that they can get away with whatever they want in this period. So Boris Johnson can now say, well, my deal's perfectly applicable, it's perfectly fine, because I just think Brexit means Brexit. It's a bit of a... But in terms of what you're saying about MPs in Parliament, I don't think there's a project to destroy Brexit and keep us in the EU and get rid of the mandate back in 2016. I think most MPs just want this out of the way, but it's about getting it out of the way. That doesn't harm working class communities and the poorest in our society. And as I pointed out earlier, this deal is going to cost everyone in the UK up to £2,000. That's £2,000 worse off. This is critical millions of families in the UK. We have to look at it, reflect, and think we can't rush into something as big as this. This deal is not appropriate for our community. It's not appropriate for our working class people. And it does not mean Brexit if it's going to ruin our country.
Good point, Guy. What about you, John? Do you think that there's a sort of agenda within the House of Commons at the moment to basically extend and basically add so much frustration that the Leavers will back off?
I think there's all kinds of agendas going on in Parliament. Remember, each of the parties have their different goals. For example, some of the more Brexit rebels from the Labour lot, just some of them want to just get Brexit done with, just so their constituencies can be happy, or just because they think leaving is the right thing. Let's see, others are doing it because they want to sabotage Corbyn for the next election stuff, because I believe many have said that if Boris was able to get the deal through, the media would have said he got Brexit done, go into a GE, people would vote for him for that, particularly most leavers, and then we'd be stuck with the Tories for another 5 years to at least 2024 and 25, I guess, depending on when the GE was called. So we'd have had 15 years of Tory, which would be then the second longest period since World War II in which the Tories have been in government.
Yeah.
Possibly longer if, depending on how big a majority they got. Well, the Dems, they probably want to stop Brexit completely. That's clear. The SNP, they probably don't want Brexit to happen, but regardless of what happens, they would probably try and, do an independence, but I think they want to try and at least stop Brexit just in case that Scotland votes no to leave again. Labour, there are those that probably want a deal, like Stephen Kinnock and possibly Lucy Powell and those MPs like that. And probably even Jeremy Corbyn thinks that we probably should have some form of soft Brexit, but they just don't want this Brexit that Boris is offering. So, yeah. Some just want to full-on stop Brexit, like just Lib Dems full-on revoke. Most of the Labour MPs at the moment want a referendum before GE, and some want a GE just so they can have a referendum and then do it with their Brexit deal, just in case, regardless how the public gets, Labour will be in a position that they can govern. So yeah,
I think there's some great points made there as well. That yes, that maybe there's some genuinity in terms of individuals there, but then we have, as John pointed out, the party politics now. As he correctly points out, that if Boris gets Brexit through on any deal, there's a very, very good likelihood he would go into any. Let's be straight here. There's going to be a general election sometime soon, and there has to be, because the numbers in Parliament just don't add up in terms of forming a majority. Mm-hmm. But if that deal is voted through and Brexit sort of goes through, Johnson could be. Somebody put one of the earlier today a comment in one of our groups, John. That Johnson could be found as evolved as a pedo, and he'd still be a hero after in the general election, because he delivered Brexit, and people are just that mad out there at the moment, aren't they? They're just
they become this entrenched with either remaining or leaving. It's like, we will do whatever it takes to get this position or the other.
Yeah.
That they may not think rationally until maybe like a few years later, and we're like, oh damn, I made a mistake here.
Yeah.
Let's see. I mean, a friend Cameron, who isn't with us today because he's busy with something else.
Yeah.
I believe he has stated that he wants to leave the EU, but he wants to make sure it's with a proper deal that's right and all that stuff. And we know that Johnson's would screw workers' things. It's one of the reasons why Dennis Skinner came out, who probably is probably a leaver, really, was going to vote against the deal because it was going to screw with workers' rights.
Yeah. And Guy, I mean, you're a young person as well, and obviously looking to the future.
Yeah.
It's people like yourselves, really, that you've got to look forward in terms of, Brexit is important and democracy needs to be sort of delivered upon. But actually, if as you come into the workplace in years to come, and you're living in a country where we're in a low tax sort of low wage kind of haven sort of space. We're not going to be as good as country post Brexit. Certainly, if we look at a deal that is being talked about by the Conservatives, then maybe a softer sort of Brexit, something that's sort of a little bit more of a closer economic relationship to Europe. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I believe, from what I understand, that EFTA would be the best one. But go on, Guy.
Yeah. Well, if I could speak on behalf of the young people I speak to, I work with, and I know, we all are quite concerned about our future because there's so much uncertainty at the moment. still quite scared of the prospect of what Brexit, as a far-right project, could do to our economy. But I think the real issue here is how the media portrayed Boris Johnson as that if he gets one vote through, if he simply passes this Brexit deal, that he's got Brexit done. That's not the case. We're going to have years and years of grueling negotiations where we will be punched, kicked, and let down, and we will suffer every day from that.
I believe even some blue Labour lot believe that if Brexit is done with, we can just go back to regular issues, which isn't going to happen. But it seems that blue Labour wouldn't mind having Brexit done, even if it meant that we get the Tories for at least another 5 years. But yeah,
absolutely, you've made a strong point there, guys. I think this is exactly what the Conservatives, Boris and the Conservatives, are relying on at the moment. Is let's let the public now get on with their lives. Let's get this thing done. But the realization, which is not being talked about, is exactly as you say, as you both have said, is that actually this is just the first hurdle of Brexit. There's going to be years of this to come.
Yeah.
And although I don't think that the extreme, i.e. what the Lib Dems are saying, revoke and let's just go back to status quo, is the right way to do things. Let me tell you, I was never a fan of a second referendum, a second sort of public vote on this, because I thought that it would become too divisive. I thought that it would really, really continue to divide and polarize our country. However, I have now sort of come to the Labour policy side of things, that actually is this maybe the deadlock out of this, really, because I think we're 3 years down the line from the referendum. We were promised so much by the Leave campaign that this would be very straightforward. This would actually enhance our economy. We would have more money to play with, to give to the NHS. We've talked about it on previous streams, haven't we, regarding the amount of figure on the bus that had been talked about. So what's your guys' view on a second referendum? Because that seems to be something that's being talked about as well at the moment.
From what I understand, I personally would prefer the EFTA-style trade agreement.
What's the EFTA style? Because the viewers may not know what that is, John. What is the EFTA style? Tell us what that is.
Cameron to be more of a, let's see.
Not with us tonight, is he? So maybe another. But what's your understanding of it, John?
From what I understand, it's a trade agreement that's, let's see, the EFTA or EEA EFTA membership is a trade association, is a regular, that allows a bit of a, let's see, it consists of 4 European states, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, the more Scandinavian countries, in which they all participate in the single market as a schism area. They are not have a part of the European Union customs union, which, from what I understand, it's a trade bloc which has close ties to the European Union, but
don't follow its rules and jurisdiction.
Yeah, from what I understand. I mean,
it's more of an economic relationship, is it?
I believe so. Though granted, let's see, Cameron would be a bit more.
So it's the free trading without the jurisdiction of the sort of following the laws and having a sort of being sort of, as they say, so-called the European Union having to say. Guy, do you know anything about this EFTA thing?
For what I know, it's the motion when they were doing the indicative votes that Nick Bowles proposed shortly before he left the Tory party because they wouldn't accept it. It's basically a sort of compromise. It's a similar style that Norway used, and it basically just keeps them in some form of customs union and single market. It's a close alignment solution, basically.
In most cases, basically. So yeah, from what I can tell, it would have probably satisfied both most of the Remainers and Leavers that are not in the extremes, but thanks to like the entrenchment, no one's really advocating it on that stuff. So I wouldn't mind if there's a second referendum. Let's see, at least it's better than revoke. I mean, in many ways, I still think a soft Brexit would probably be the best solution. But I think, let's see, if there's a Remain option that says, all right, here's a deal that Parliament will likely at least support or will support, and if you still want to remain, you can remain. So heck, I think that could work. Granted, the only question would be is how the more diehard Leavers is, because I think Nigel Farage has stated he won't vote in it. So some might argue that it's so some might just argue that this second referendum is just a stitch up by the establishment to stay in the thing, which could potentially happen. And if we do probably end up remaining in the EU, there'll probably be a lot of Leavers or people that voted for.
Well,
hold on, let me just finish. And there's those that, like, if we end up remaining, those who would like vote who are just so entrenched and leaving might just never vote again, which I'm not sure how that will affect democracy for a bit, but hey.
Alfie Watts says in a comment, if a second referendum is in order, we cannot have a Remain option because that undermines 17.2 million people that vote to leave in 2016. I believe it was a little bit more than 17.2, but there you go. Just because protesters want it the other way.
I'd be willing to address this point because it's a valid point, and it's probably the most common concern when it comes to people talking about a second referendum. Now, a couple of years ago, when the country voted to leave, as quite an ardent Remainer at the time, I was quite disappointed, but understood that we needed to go through with what people had said. But over the years, slowly but surely, we found out that what we were promised and what we were told is not actually fabricated into what we have now. What we have now is a deal that undermines workers' rights, environmental regulations, and leaves us worse off. So we're not being given what we've promised, which means that we need some sort of democratic exercise to go back to the people and say, is this what you voted for in 2016? But Alfie's concern is extremely legit, and it's extremely important, because if we have another referendum and it ends up swaying to Remain by an extremely small margin, that can't be finished business, because 17.4 million people in 2016 did vote to leave, and they all had very legitimate concerns about the way the EU cooperated with our country and the way our country was being run. So even if we were to vote Remain in a second referendum, regardless of what the deal next to it was, if we were to vote Remain, we would still have to address the issues that Leavers had, because we can't just have a second referendum, vote Remain, and then say that's the end of it, it's done, we've revoked, we're not ever going to look at the issue again.
I quite agree. I think it's a difficult one. Who would accept that? Because then you'd have people saying, well, let's have a third referendum to see what happens on the third occasion, best of 3, best of 5. You know, it's a difficult one, isn't it, John?
Yeah, ideally, if there was to be some sort of like second ref or people's vote thing or whatever you want to call it, it might have been, let's see, ideally, we could have possibly done where you had one deal versus another deal, which you like possibly back in 2018 and early 2019, where you had May's deal versus Corbyn's deal or something like that. And you say, and you go to the public, which deal do you prefer? This one or this one? But of course, with which entrenchment, and the only ones that really advocating for a second vote is, face it, just for the most part, Remainers, really. None of the Leavers really want one.
And that's the problem, because I remember somebody put on Twitter yesterday that this march that's taking place out there is not a march for a second referendum. It's a march for Remain. And I have to say, she has a point, doesn't she?
Yes. Anyways, most of those people that just those people are like they're just marching for Remain, and they're probably just mostly keeping to the people's vote thing because, well, second ref probably sounds a bit more toxic than people's vote, than the name people's vote, because when you say the word people's vote, so I kept saying people there, it sounds like it's something that the public's like, all right, this is something that I can vote in and decide my decision and stuff, while second ref sounds like, oh no, not the mess that was in 2016 again, not this again.
Yeah. So the medium sort of idea then, in terms of we've talked about this on many occasions. We have the extreme Brexiteers on one side, i.e. the Brexit Party and the Conservative Party. We have the extreme on the other side, which is the Lib Dems, who are talking about if we win a general election, we want to revoke Article 50. And then we have the seemingly sensible option in the middle, which is the Labour option, which is saying that actually We do respect, obviously, the result of the the referendum in 2016. What we would do is that if we were to come into government, if we were to win a majority, we'll go to Europe, negotiate the deal, which I think we're all aware will be a softer, sort of closer tied relationship to Europe. But what we would do is we would put that back to the people, would remain on one side of the ballot and their deal on the other side of the ballot. Now, I know there's been talks about where Labour would campaign in that respect. Personally, I think that if you go and negotiate a deal with the EU, you have to back your deal. That's my personal opinion. But I mean, look, I've just put a comment from Alfie again. Do we think that Labour can genuinely get a majority? Polls suggesting otherwise. Now, within the context of what I've just said, i.e. the most sensible option, because I think the majority of the population are sensible thinking, middle of the road type people. We don't hear about them so much because the media wants us to have this polarized kind of concept and understanding. I think the majority of people are middle of the road, and I think there's a very good chance, polls apart, that Labour could win that next election whenever it happens. Timing is everything, but I think they could win. What's your thoughts on that, sort of the fact that actually we've got these three entities?
Yeah.
Polls aren't showing Labour with a great sort of chance. Guy, I want to bring you in. What do you think?
Well, of course, we've got to be slightly concerned about where Labour is at in the polls at the moment, considering we've had nearly a decade of Tory rule that's crippled the majority of our society through endless cuts and devastation through austerity.
Yeah.
But I think with polls, you've got to consider two things. One, you take them with a pinch of salt. They're not used to measure public opinion, they're used to influence public opinion. And I also just want to point out that 7 weeks before the 2017 general election, Labour were polling at 24% and the Tories 48%, and we finished that election on 40%. But quite rightly, as Alfie says, we've got to think as to whether any party can get a majority at this rate, but also compare the fact that in 2017 to now, we're in very different times. Now our society is more polarised, more divided than ever. And I think the options we have on Brexit are quite simply three options. Either you vote Tory or you vote Brexit Party, and you get a hard, clean break deal that will devastate our economy and devastate our communities. You go to the other side of the spectrum and you get with the Lib Dems and potentially with the SNP, who just want to outright revoke, cancel everything that happened in 2016. Or you vote Labour, a middle ground policy that puts a sensible deal that's good for working people against Remain in a confirmatory referendum. And quite frankly, for me, that is the best solution. But the way Labour win the next election is on the footing of reversing the devastating cuts of the last 10 years and reinvesting in our communities and the poorest.
Well, the idea behind that is that it pulls Remainers in and it pulls Leavers in, really. But I guess the problem is that
the execution has been rather poor, not to mention you had extreme entrenchment where if you support one side, you're evil, and if you're not, so it's like if you're either with us or against us at this point. But see, I will say, when it comes to the polls, they haven't always exactly been accurate. For example, before the 2015 election, most polls had Labour either in the lead or looked like they were going to be the largest party, but then it ended up being Conservative majority. And then, of course, before the 2017 election, the Conservatives were always in the lead in the polls. Mostly 10 points or something. Granted, there was a brief little period, I think, before the referendum where Labour actually were in the lead in like a few polls, particularly by 1 point, really. That's not really much, but still. And funny enough, it was YouGov of all polling that did it. If you look at the 2017 polls, I know I could bring them up just to show you, but let's see. But after the referendum, the infighting with Labour with the second leadership, the Conservatives had a massive lead until the election, which changed things for Labour. And Labour afterwards were, for most part, ahead of the polls for 2017 to early 2018. And then late 2018, it was either Tories or Labour that was in the head, usually by a few points, but polling for most part was a bit normal for the two. Let's see. Now, granted, in 2019, after the splits from the parties, the new Brexit party form, extension, the locals and EUs, the two main parties went down in the polls, back to like the 20s and stuff, barely making the 30s occasionally. Then Johnson came along. Conservatives, for the most part, led every poll except two. One which had Labour in the lead just by 1 point, and another had them on tie. But let's see. But from what most polls these days, either have the Conservatives winning a massive majority or a landslide, or either being the largest party or just a small majority. So it's not really looking good at the moment, which is probably one of the reasons why Labour have kind of shifted to more like try and get a referendum before GE, just in case they might lose, because let's see, they can't really afford to lose another election by going down in seats, because it won't be similar to what happened in 1992, where they gained seats but didn't win, but because they'll be back down to a few seats, either back to where they were in 2015, maybe slightly better or slightly worse. But yeah, that's one of the reasons. Granted, as for whether or not Labour can get a majority, that really depends. Mostly, it's either if they can win back Scotland, or the Tory vote is split between them and the Brexit party, since due to the fact that Labour lost Scotland, it's been very hard for them to like get an outright majority in most of the polls predicted when you go to electoral calculus or favourable politics, due to the fact that Labour often relied on Scotland, and when there was the independence movement, that's sort of been a massive blow to the party in terms of electorally, really, because they lost 40 seats in one particular region of the entire United Kingdom, and nearly all their seats in an entire country, basically, part of the United Kingdom. Let's see, which is ironic, because if Labour didn't lose their seats in the 2015 election to the SNP, Labour would have actually had an increase of seats. They would have been, in the election, would have looked very similar to what happened in 1992, where the Conservatives had a slim majority, but Labour were around 270 seats. But that didn't happen, and they're now down to 230. For whether or not, granted, let's see, Labour doesn't really need to form a majority to get the next government if they can make an arrangement with the SNP or some of the other smaller parties. But from what I understand, for at least one single party, let's see, for the minority government, for the SNP, if they're predicted to get 50, Labour will at least need to get 276 seats, just for like the very slimmest of majorities, which won't be really all that stable, but at least forms a government. Let's see.
That, doesn't it?
Yeah. The only let's see, if they get below that, they'll probably have to rely on smaller parties like Plaid Cymru, the Greens, and maybe one of the other Northern Irish parties if they take seats off Sinn Féin or the DUP. They're more willing to go into Parliament and work with Labour. Granted, but yeah, because at the moment we clearly can't rely on the Liberal Democrats. Unless we get a different leader that's more to their liking, which I don't really see happening at the moment.
Well, why should we?
But yeah, that's like our party, we choose who our leader is and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Labour at least needs 276 seats, and and get the backing of the SNP if they want to form a government at minimum. But granted, if they split the vote enough, they could potentially get. Let's see, if the Leave vote is split between the Tories and Brexit deep enough, they could potentially get a majority, but it'll be very hard. Granted, the Tories are more likely to get a majority than any other party at the moment, just due to the fact that
that's what the polls are saying. That's what the polls are saying, but we've got to take the polls, as Guy said, with a pinch of salt.
Yes, a pinch of salt. After all, a general election could change anything. I mean, granted, what's going on right now could change everything, because it looked like the Tories were dead certain to win, but now this has damaged them to an extent. Granted, it's not yet, because the media is going like Brexit, Boris here and stuff, but it's very possible that with more time, people looking at the deal, they may more and more turn against it and stuff. Or let's say you have more people in Parliament turn against the deal, but who knows? We'll see. Anyway, go on.
Guy, let's sort of go back to the script now in terms of what's happened yesterday in the House of Commons. So the Letwin amendment is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it looks as if it had forced Boris to go and get an extension, which he said he never would.
Yes. Well, on Saturday, what we had was a bit of an issue in terms of the safety of our country, in terms of crashing out with no deal, because the Ben bill, I know there's a lot of bills and amendments we have to sort through, so I'll try and make this as simple as possible. But the Ben bill stated if a deal was not passed by Saturday 11 p.m., Boris Johnson is forced to pass an extension. Now, the concern was that if Boris had passed his deal on Saturday, he could have then taken it through the rest of the week, disagreed on some other elements, and crashed us out with no deal at the end of the week. So what the Letwin Amendment did was ensure that Boris Johnson had to ask for that extension so that we couldn't crash out with no deal. So what we know at the moment is that Boris Johnson sent a letter to the EU requesting an extension, but he hasn't signed it. And he's also attached a letter on the back saying we don't really want this extension. So we've got to consider, considering it's law that he has to request an extension from the EU, is that complying with the law? There's talk potentially from big figures like Gina Miller, who's won against the government twice when taking them to the Supreme Court. There's questions as to whether we could see Boris Johnson be embroiled in further court cases this week, because sending an extension and attaching a letter saying, oh, actually, no, we don't really want it, could be actually breaking the terms of the Ben Act. So that's an interesting point to think about.
So, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I think the way that you've put that analysis together is spot on. Interesting, though, that Letwin says that he's ready to vote for this deal, but obviously it needs its scrutiny. But if you again follow some commentators on Twitter, certainly I mentioned Lewis Goodall, the analysis that he makes and puts together talks about that actually, given the strong position the opposition parties are in at this moment in terms of the numbers that they have, they could really put a spanner in the works for Johnson's deal, couldn't they?
Yeah,
they could either do a customs union amendment, a second referendum amendment.
That's what they're talking about. And if you imagine how difficult it's been for Johnson and Conservative leadership to get everybody together. Granted, they couldn't get the DUP together, but
they've backstabbed the DUP, and they're really pissed off that they might just do anything to screw them over.
Let's talk about that, John. Tell us what's happened with the DUP. How have they pissed the DUP off?
Well, it's kind of just like they've arranged that instead of like the DUP going full on with the rest of the United Kingdom, that they'll get their own they'll still be in a sort of customs union arrangement, from what I understand. And the DUP want to be in the same spot as everyone else in the United Kingdom. So let's see, granted, the only reason I'm told by a friend from Ireland, or at least Northern Ireland, that's the only reason the DUP want to leave it from the first place was to separate from the Republic Island a bit more. But yeah. So
isn't it John about this border in the Irish Sea? Didn't he promise them that?
Yeah, he's broken their promises. The DUP have probably realised that the ERG has turned against them. They don't really have. They're clearly being backstabbed by the Conservative Party, which they usually end up being screwed over with, but they never really learn their lesson for like long periods of time. But in the short term, they're angry. They're going to vote against Johnson's deal. Probably they might some of the amendments to that make sure if there is a deal that everyone gets treated the same. So they might ignore. They might not support him in the vote of no confidence.
Yeah, and this is what makes it all interesting now, because if you watch some of the interviews of Arlene Foster, Nigel Dodds, etc., the guys who are at the top of the DUP, the leadership, they're fuming. And what we also heard is that when the deal was announced and everything was brought out into the media, Boris or nobody from the Conservative leadership had even been in touch with them. So that probably added insult to injury. So what we have now is, and this is where the drama gets really sort of interesting now, because we have a DUP party that is potentially up for some serious revenge and up for putting some serious assault upon this government. And the only way to do that is to frustrate them through their voting mechanisms, really, and basically using their king-making sort of the way that they've been king-making, opposing the Tories. Now, just as we talked about, you mentioned yourself, John, that actually, if there are some Brexiteers on the opposition side who are thinking about backing this customs union amendment. Now, if it were to be the case that formed a majority, which has a very, very good chance, according to Lewis Goodall, of doing so, doesn't that then, and let's just say the DUP backs something like that, because don't forget, an entire customs union would sort out the Northern Ireland issue. Imagine if that were to happen. Aren't we in the territory again of splitting the ERG and the remainder of the Conservatives? Because the ERG will never go for a customs union, will they?
No, they're die hard. Hardest Brexit or no deal or bust, really. Let's see, but yeah. Let's see. Granted, for all we know, the DUP could... Well, granted, the DUP haven't said they're not going to back a second referendum, but if they could be persuaded to, that could also happen as well. I mean, during the whole indicative votes, I believe a second referendum was only 12 votes away from actually happening. Granted, the customs union was only 3 votes away, so who knows? Customs union, more likely, but either way, let's see, it seems like general election or second referendum is likely to happen within the following weeks.
And Guy, just bringing it back to you again, this Conservative Party, and I'll tell you where I think this is all started. Theresa May in 2017 had not a great majority, but a majority enough to put all of this legislation through. Brexit would have been delivered. Out of sheer arrogance, she called the general election, because she thought, we talked about the polls earlier, we talked about the polling numbers at that time, 25-point lead. She thought Corbyn, weak leader, so-called weak leader, that she was going to blast the hell out of the Labour Party, destroy the Labour Party, and call a snap general election. She was in tears on election night, because actually that snap general election ended up in her losing her majority, right? And then Brexit was put on the frying pan, because it was started to disappear, because then the remainder of Parliament, through those numbers that she unintentionally engineered, began to start frying Brexit up. Now, it caused her resignation. Then her successor comes in, and we've seen a lot of unity. We've seen a lot of aggressive approach in terms of the 21 MPs who lost the whip. But if you look at all of those stories and you put them together, the formation of Brexit and the idea to have a referendum was the Conservatives. The calling of a general election was done by the Conservatives, and ended up obviously in them losing their majority. The majority is now in a situation, it's minus 40 something because of the arrogance.
Minus 45, I believe.
Minus 45, thank you, John. Shown the arrogance shown by Boris Johnson and the leadership team, right? And here we have now, and this is where I want to get your perspective on this, Guy, have still the right-wing media, the Telegraph, the Express, making out that the Tories and Boris Johnson is some kind of heroic figure that needs to get Brexit delivered, and that actually it's everyone else's fault.
Well, yeah, they're right-wing media. They're never going to admit fault with, like, the Conservatives. I mean, granted, they criticise May a lot more because after, let's see,
they do that because they can see the end is nigh. But I wanted to bring Guy in here because I just haven't heard from a few minutes. But okay. I'll bring you back in as well, John, in a second. But Guy, tell us what you know.
Yeah. I mean,
are we in a parallel universe or something where reality just doesn't work, doesn't exist?
going back to 2016, your point about Theresa May, when she won the Conservative leadership, the sensible thing to do would have been to sit down with all of the parties and gone, right, what are the kind of compromises we can make here and deliver this on behalf of the people of this country? And that's what a prime minister is there to do, act in the national interest. But she got cocky, she got arrogant, and despite claiming 3 times on national television we would not have a snap general election, she called a snap general election and shot herself in the foot. And then from that point on, we had an unstable coalition between the DUP and the Tories railroading through, well, I would say the worst deal, but the second worst deal, now that we've seen Boris Johnson's proposal. The House rejected it outright 3 times. Then they pushed Theresa May out, and we were left with a situation where the hard right had gained control of the Conservative Party, and we now have Boris Johnson negotiating a hard right Brexit. So this has been Conservative incompetence from day one, refusing to negotiate with the other parties, refusing compromise, and we've gotten so much of a mess. And I think people, because of the media's perspective on this, are blinded to the fact that this is the fault of the Tories. It's not the fault of Remain MPs. It's not the fault of Labour opposing what they're doing. That's scrutiny. That's called opposition. It's the fault of the Conservative Party, who have been so careless over the last decade and since the referendum, of simply not being able to work cooperatively. And that's why we're in this situation. It's such a shame that the media won't portray this situation as what it is. It's Conservative recklessness.
Well, to be honest, the media, the right wing, face it, most of our papers usually end up endorsing the Conservatives. The only exception I can see was when Tony Blair was leading the Labour Party and he struck a deal with Rupert Murdoch at the time, so they ended up backing him for a few elections until he was gone. But so they're not going to ever paint Boris in a bad light, not unless he actually loses, because before the 2017 election, the Tories were trying to the media was portraying Theresa May as the second coming of Margaret Thatcher, and Jeremy Corbyn was Michael Foot. And they did that until after she lost her majority. And it's in fact, they tried to blame her more than just say, ooh, look how skilled Corbyn was during this election and stuff. But yeah, I mean, after all, if there's one thing the media does not want, at least the right-wing media does not want they do not want a Jeremy Corbyn government, because, he will reverse many of the things that, at least from the Thatcher period, has gone down, or reform the economy and the media into ways that they don't like. So, yeah, they will portray Johnson as this tough as nails thing until finally he starts mucking up, really, which at the moment...
And mucked up he has, I think it's fair to say. Because
mucked up in their eyes. At one point, he's no longer a winnable thing for the country or for themselves. They will turn against him. But until then, they will portray him as a hero.
And good point, John. And let's just, for our viewers, make this very, very clear, just so that there's no brainwashing going on here, right? I can't tell you, I've lost count the number of times in the 89 days that Boris Johnson has been Prime Minister that he has said that he will not be seeking an extension. He was quoted as saying some weeks ago, when he was asked, will you seek an extension? He said, no, I would rather be dead in a ditch.
Yeah.
What did he do last night? For our viewers,
he asked a letter of extension. Though apparently sent 2 other letters saying don't do it.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on that, guys, actually, because that's interesting. Again, John and Guy, you both made excellent points about the role of the mainstream media, the mainly right-wing media in this country. And when I was following this on Twitter last night, I was actually, because they were talking about that he needs to send this letter before 11 p.m. And I was watching closely to see whether this letter would be sent. And then we heard that he'd sent these 2 or 3 letters. These 3 letters is a covering letter. There was a second letter with the with the original sort of letter of requesting an extension. But it had been noticed that although his name was on the letter, he hadn't signed it. And rather than the right-wing media focusing on the fact that Boris Johnson has requested an extension when he said that he wouldn't in his 89 days or his 88 days of Prime Minister premiership, the focus instead was on the fact that he didn't sign a letter, which, as we now know, if we look at tweets from Donald Tusk and others who were a part of the European Union sort of negotiating team, is minuscule. It means absolutely nothing, because actually the first letter, was recognised as the letter, and they will now look at negotiating and talking about an extension. But how, Guy, does the mainstream media attempt to control the minds of millions through their manipulation?
Yeah, well, the reason Boris Johnson's Prime Minister is because he ran on a ticket of October 31st, do or die. And people saw that he was being ultimately conclusive that that was the day, and by all means we would leave. And as you said, he said he'd rather be seen, was it dead in a ditch, than to request an extension. So instead of the mainstream media doing their job, informing the British people an unbiased point of view and telling them, well, actually, your Prime Minister, who said he was not going to call an extension at all costs, has actually gone and called an extension on Brexit. They said, well, an extension has been asked, but he's actually attached on the back that he doesn't want to do it, so it's fine. He still made those promises, and they've been so wishy-washy about it, and they're quite frankly lying to the British public, and it's all part of this big scheme and let's call it what it is, the right-wing media in this country, owned by Rupert Murdoch, to make sure that Tories and the hard right in Parliament stay in power. Because if people start to understand that he's called this extension and he's asked the EU to prolong Brexit, he'll start losing his voter base, the voter base he's built up for months now. And I'm conscious that, the stream's reached a kind of an hour now and we need to wind up, but we do really need to address the concern that the mainstream media are letting down the British public in terms of their honesty, their transparency, and their duty to inform the citizens of this country.
Excellent point. You're absolutely right. We reached the hour point. Finally, the last sort of thing that I want to just mention, we can wrap up in the next 3 or 4 minutes, no doubt, is a general election. John, coming back to you now. Is it time now let's look on a left point of view, a Labour point of view, right? Is now not the best time now to bring a vote of non-confidence in this government, in Boris Johnson, and call for a general election?
Ooh, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, at first they need to make sure no deal is off the table, then go for a GE, or at least to have an extension before, guarantee that an extension is going to happen, and then at best, let's see, have a GE.
Okay, let's say,
granted, I will say
Tuesday, Wednesday. Let's just say by the end of the week coming up, extension is granted, or it looks like it's going to be granted. What's your next move?
Let's see. Personally, I'd probably do some form of GEE. Granted, I can understand the argument of having some sort of making sure that at least a possibility of a referendum happening or something like that during that time could happen. If not, I'd probably go for GE. Let's see, then fight the darndest to try and get as much majority. Granted, let's see, since if Boris doesn't pass his deal, Labour has a bit of a chance to try and win. Granted, at the moment, it doesn't look like they have a strong chance, but if they can at least get at least keep the seats they have, or back to where they were in 2017, or slightly increase from 2017, they could form a government, or at least prevent the Tories from forming a government without another party. And if so, it may possibly be that if the Tories can't form a majority government, they may not be able to get Brexit done and stuff, unless they work with the Brexit party if the Brexit party get any seats. But no, it really depends on what. It really depends what happens next week. Granted, seems like from what Keir Starmer's implying, they might try to do a referendum first. But if that fails, they should call a GE. Because at the moment, from the looks of it, in some of our Twitter chat groups, there are some people that are getting frustrated with Labour taking so long and starting to get, really fed up with the leadership at this point, and probably wouldn't mind if someone else like Rebecca Long-Bailey just ends up replacing Corbyn's leader.
Well, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. I don't think Corbyn is personally going anywhere.
I agree, but there are those that are feeling very
they've
frustrated.
been going around for a long time, and I don't think that now would be for the Labour Party the right time.
It'd be too chaotic to replace leader right now. But regardless, one way or another, Corbyn's probably going to be the leader that takes us into the next general election, and members and MPs will have to try their best to make sure they can either get this guy in charge or at least stop the Tories from getting majority next election. But yeah.
Okay, Guy. Before I'm going to just try and get this up on screen now.
Don't you want to ask him about the whole G?
Just within the context of this, I'm going to just bring this on the screen because this is what I want. Guy, I want to request him to sort of finally talk about this. Can you see that on your screen, guys? The Lewis Goodall thread there.
Yeah.
Right?
And I'm just getting a charger for my laptop. Okay. Yeah, I see the thread.
Guy, want to get your view on this, and this is really pivotal now because in terms of what's going to happen moving forward. I'll just quickly summarise what Lewis is saying. Lewis Goodall, Sky News, is there's a very good chance because the government are going to try and bring this vote back tomorrow. But there's a very good chance that the Speaker, because of the duplication issue, probably may refuse the deal coming back in. More so because of the amendment that has been made, that the legal position is that they would need to agree the legal text before the text of the deal comes back. So it looks like that's going to elongate and not come back in. We see then Lewis also talking about that he says here, huge problems storing up for the government next week. Plan is to bring MV back. I think almost certain not to happen. The Speaker ruled it out. Same issue twice. Contradicts the Letwin amendment, which says Brexit-related it looks like there's going to have to be an extension here granted, and it looks like that the Tories are going to be in a screwed up state and situation. I say general elections coming. What do you reckon, Guy?
One way or another, a referendum or G is coming. More likely a G than a ref, but who knows? But the more this goes out and the more people see Boris Johnson's deal for what it is, the more they're likely to turn on it. Who knows? I mean, it's one of the reasons why Nigel Farage, of all people, backed the Ban Act before it looks like Joe Johnson's deal is, because if this gets passed, he knows that his party might be finished. At the same time, he wants a die-hard Brexit and all that stuff. So, let's see, he probably wants to try and overtake the Tories, maybe even Labour at one point, and become one of the two new main parties. Whether or not that'll happen due to our first-past-the-post system, but who knows? But yeah.
What do you think, Guy?
Yeah, if the government can't bring the deal next week, and we're going to have to wait and see, because I don't think anyone's sure as to what's going to happen and whether John Bercow is going to kind of stop the government bringing it. But if the deal is not brought next week, we go at that to a point where we need an extension. So we don't crash out on October 31st. And in law, you just request one. I reckon the EU would accept it. Then if we have an extension, I think it's pivotal that we have a general election where Boris Johnson puts his deal to the public and says, this is what I want to do in terms of Brexit, and then puts all of his other policies along with that. But then against that, Labour will explain to the electorate that Boris Johnson's deal will do irreparable damage to our economy. It will hurt the working class citizens in our country, and it will do damage that we cannot reverse for decades to come. But also put Labour's positive alternative of a middle ground, where if we were to get a mandate, in that time of an extension, we could go back leading a government, either ourselves or with the SNP, carrying out Labour Brexit policy, which is a sensible Brexit deal versus Remain in a second referendum. And that would sort this whole situation out. If the government, by some miracle, are able to bring the deal next week, and it looks like it's got to pass, I think the only option for Labour is try to attach a customs union arrangement or a second referendum to it to mitigate that damage. But it looks like we're going into an extension period where some sort of democratic vote will happen, be it a second referendum or be it an election, and that's got to happen.
Okay, that's brilliant, and some well-made points. My personal opinion is I think it depends upon the length of extension given. I think they're talking about sort of 3 months, February kind of time, which to me spells general election. And
Yeah.
I think whatever those numbers are at the end of that general election is going to spell what happens if the Tories win. I will predict there will be a no-deal Brexit because they will have the numbers for that, and it will be a clean, crash-out WTO Brexit. I think if Labour win, or as you've mentioned there, Guy, they get some form of majority or coalition or sort of working with another party like the SNP, I think it's very possible that their Brexit strategy of a second referendum unfolds. Don't ask me who will win that, but I have a strong feeling that Leave would win again. And Lib Dem, sorry, I'm not even going to talk about Lib Dems winning because it's never going to happen. So forget that. Listen, guys, brilliant. John, listen, final word from you. And anything you want to add to that before we wrap up?
Not really, but you know, in many ways, Howard Wilson used to say a week is a long time in politics, but it's now seems like an hour is a long time in politics.
It is, absolutely. And Guy, John, thank you both for coming on. I think over the coming days, there's probably going to be more need for us to get on and live stream and do some more of this, just to get our viewers informed and give an alternative to the corrupt mainstream media out there. Thank you guys for coming on tonight. Thanks for your time. To our viewers, please share the content. If you liked it, then please give us a like and share. Follow us on Twitter on @YouthViews, as you can see on screen, and please retweet the video as well. We've been Youth Views. Thanks to my guests, John and Guy. We look forward to seeing you all soon. Good night and God bless.